A rough voice barked, "We're not serving you." J.D. Vance refused service at diner. What he did next stunned everyone. They told J.D. Vance to get out, figuring he'd lose his cool and thus storm away from Brothers Sandwich Haven in a huff. What he did instead left every soul in that diner frozen, mouths shut, eyes wide. J.D. Vance guided his beat-up pickup truck into the gravel lot of Brothers Sandwich Haven, a tired little outpost just off Highway 68 in Springfield, Ohio. The sun was dipping below the horizon, splashing the sky with streaks of orange and pink, the light bouncing off the diner's faded green siding and cracked windows. A neon sign buzzed faintly overhead. Brothers Sandwich Haven, open late, its glow weak against the dusk, competing with the chirping crickets kicking up in the soybean fields, stretching out beyond the lot. This place had roots, deep ones, probably serving burgers and coffee since the Eisenhower days. A lifeline for truckers rolling through, factory workers clocking out, and locals who'd never wandered more than 20 miles from their front porches. The cool evening air carried a mix of smells: grilled onions sharp on the nose, melted cheese thick and heavy, coffee strong enough to peel paint, slipping out every time the glass door creaked open or banged shut. He'd heard about it earlier that day, maybe 2 p.m., from a mechanic at a Shell station 10 miles back down the road. The guy, mid-40s, grease under his nails, a faded Ohio State cap pulled low, had leaned against Vance's truck while the gas pumped, chewing on a toothpick and raving about the place. "Best roast beef sandwich this side of the state," he'd said, voice gravelly from too many cigarettes. "Fries cut thick, crispy, worth every mile." Vance had nodded, half listening, his mind still tangled in the day's mess. 15 hours of it, meetings that dragged like wet cement, handshakes with sweaty palms and fake smiles, policy debates with aides and locals that spun in circles and landed nowhere. He was spent, hollowed out, his stomach growling louder than his thoughts. All he wanted now was a booth in the corner, a plate of something hot, and a quiet hour before the 60-mile drive back to his hotel in Columbus under a star-scattered sky. The bell above the door let out a loud, brassy clang as he pushed inside, the sound bouncing off the walls. The diner wasn't much to look at, 25 feet wide, maybe 30 deep, with a row of red leather booths along the front windows, their cushions cracked and patched with duct tape. A counter ran parallel, lined with wobbly stools, the kind that squeaked if you shifted wrong. Near the register, a wall was cluttered with old photos, black and white snaps of cooks in white aprons flipping patties, kids slurping milkshakes through striped straws, and two brothers, arms around each other, grinning outside the diner, back when the paint was fresh and the sign still shone bright. The air hit him like a warm hug, greasy with bacon fat, rich with coffee brewing on a burner, a faint whiff of ketchup and mustard lingering from someone's meal. About 15 people dotted the place, regulars mostly, hunched over plates of fries and burgers. Their voices a low, steady hum, like tires on a quiet road. Vance shrugged off his coat, draping it over his arm, feeling the day's weight start to lift. This was his kind of spot, unfussy, real, a slice of the America he'd grown up in, far from the polished halls and podiums he navigated now. He took a deep breath, the smell of fryer oil and coffee grounding him, promising a break. Then he caught the hostess's eye. She was young, mid-20s, blonde ponytail swinging, a smile starting to curve her lips, pure muscle memory, until it stopped dead. Recognition flashed across her face, quick as lightning. She didn't know him personally, but she knew of him, his face from TV, his name from the papers, the senator who stirred up love and hate in equal measure. Her smile vanished, lips pressing tight, and her hand hovered over a stack of greasy menus, stuck like she'd forgotten what came next. Vance scanned the room, quick but deliberate. A guy in a flannel shirt, mid-bite into a roast beef sandwich, paused and leaned over to whisper to his wife, a woman with tired eyes and a red scarf. She nodded, her gaze flicking to Vance, then dropping fast. A woman in a denim jacket, nursing a coffee at the counter, set her mug down with a sharp thunk that echoed, her eyes narrowing before she turned to stare out the window at the darkening lot. The hum of voices didn't fade. It tightened, sharpened, like the air before a storm. Vance wasn't new to this game. He'd walked into plenty of places where the mood flipped fast. Town halls where half the crowd clapped and half hissed. Press rooms where every question hit a jab. Rural gas stations where his suit got more side-eye than a city slicker deserved. He could feel a room turn. But a diner, Brothers Sandwich Haven, tucked away in nowhere, Ohio, this was supposed to be safe ground, a refuge from the noise. The hostess stepped forward, tugging at her apron strings, brushing a loose hair back with a shaky hand. "Hey," she said, her voice clipped, careful, like she was tiptoeing through a minefield. "You eating here or grabbing it to go?" He let out a small, worn-out laugh, rubbing the back of his neck where the tension sat. "Eating here if you've got room." She didn't answer right away. The silence stretched, 8, 9 seconds. Too long for a simple question. Her eyes darted to the kitchen, then snapped back, her jaw tightening like she'd bitten down on something sour. "Hold on," she said, flat and final. "I need to check something." She turned and slipped through the swinging kitchen door, the hinges squeaking as it swung shut behind her, leaving him standing there, coat still over his arm, feeling like he'd just stepped into a room where the rules had changed. The diner shifted gears, not loud, not yet, but the tension crept in like fog. A big guy at the counter, shoulders broad under a faded Carhartt jacket, twisted around on his stool to stare, his plate of fries untouched. A woman in a booth near the door muttered something low, her words swallowed by the hum, but her glance at Vance was sharp. He stood still, hands sliding into his pockets, every pair of eyes prickling his skin like needles. Some looks darted away when he glanced back, guilty, quick. Others held firm, cold and unflinching, sizing him up. From behind the kitchen doors, voices sparked, short, clipped, rising and falling, too muffled to catch but loud enough to mean something was up. He rolled his shoulders, trying to shake the unease clawing its way up his back. He wasn't here to stir the pot. He wasn't here to throw his weight around. He was just a guy, hungry, worn thin, chasing a hot meal after a day that had beaten him down. The hostess returned, her steps quick and clipped, her face set like she'd made up her mind, or someone had made it for her. "Sorry, sir," she said, her voice louder now, firm as a locked gate. "We can't serve you tonight." The words landed like a brick through a window, sharp and sudden. The diner didn't go dead quiet, not quite, but it hushed, the kind of stillness where you could hear the fryer popping in the back, the faint scrape of a fork against porcelain. Vance didn't move, didn't blink, just stood there letting it sink in, heavy and real. The hostess crossed her arms, chin lifted, braced for whatever came next. "Can I ask why?" he said, keeping his voice low, steady, like he was asking about the specials instead of being kicked out. She didn't budge. "We'd rather not serve you tonight. No excuses, no, we're full, no kitchen's closed." Just that, blunt, cold, straight to the point. The room held its breath. A knife tapped a plate somewhere. A guy coughed, rough and fast. Vance scanned the faces. Some ducked down to their food, some stared right through him like he was a ghost in their midst. He caught a glimpse of the kitchen through the pass-through window. 2 cooks, one with a scruffy beard and a stained apron, the other in a faded Reds cap, peering out from behind a stack of plates under a flickering heat lamp. Their faces were blank, unreadable, like they were waiting to see how this played out. Vance shifted his stance, hands settling on his hips, feeling every stare like a spotlight burning into him. "Did I do something wrong?" he asked, voice calm, not accusing, just trying to understand. "It's not that," she said quick, cutting him off. "We're just not serving you." A low, gravelly laugh broke the quiet. Vance turned his head. An older man at the counter, 60 or so, blue jacket patched at the elbows, hands rough and scarred from decades of hard work, shook his head like he'd seen this story play out before. He stabbed at a pile of cold fries with his fork, muttering something under his breath, too quiet to catch but heavy with meaning. A few booths down, a woman in a gray sweatshirt shifted in her seat, her face a blank slate, unreadable. Across from her, a younger guy, around 30, buzzed hair, leather jacket, leaned back with his arms crossed, a smirk tugging at his lips like he'd paid good money for the show and was waiting for the fireworks. Vance felt it all, the quick glances that dodged his, the stares that lingered like blades, the ones that carried a strange, quiet satisfaction. He had choices here, plenty of them. Walk out, shake it off, let the night bury this moment in the dust of Highway 68, or push back, demand an explanation, raise his voice, remind them he wasn't just some drifter off the road. He was a U.S. Senator, a name, a face, someone who could turn this into tomorrow's breaking news with one phone call. But he didn't budge, Didn't snap, just nodded, slow and deliberate, like he was weighing every angle. Okay, he said, voice even. Can I speak to the manager? That threw them off. The hostess blinked, her arms dropping a little, caught mid-breath like she hadn't seen it coming. The old guy at the counter grumbled something low, a mix of surprise and disdain. A woman by the window, ponytail swinging, sipping coffee, let out a short, sharp laugh, like she couldn't believe he'd dare to escalate. Vance stood steady, calm as a man waiting out a rain delay, like he'd already decided this wasn't over until he understood it. The hostess hesitated, her eyes flicking to the kitchen again, then back to him. She turned and darted through a side door marked "Staff Only," the hinges groaning as it swung shut. The diner froze. Coffee cups paused halfway to lips, forks hovering over plates, breaths held tight like the air itself was waiting. Then the door banged open, loud and hard against the wall, and out stepped a man, early 50s, broad as a barn door, arms crossed over a grease-streaked apron that smelled of fryer oil and burnt toast. His name tag read Don. He didn't smile, didn't offer a hand, just marched up to Vance and stopped, sizing him up like he was a stray wandered in off the highway. Heard you've got a question, Don said, his voice rough as a gravel road, daring him to push it further. Vance met his stare, steady, unflinching, like he'd faced worse than this and come out standing. Yeah, he said. I'd like to know why you won't serve me, Don snorted, wiping his hands on his apron like he was brushing off the whole damn night. He glanced around, half the diner pretending to eat, the other half glued to the scene, then locked eyes with Vance again. Look, it's not personal, he said, but his jaw tightened, the words sounding hollow even to him. Feels pretty personal, Vance replied, one eyebrow lifting just a hair, his tone still calm but pressing now. Don rubbed the back of his neck, letting out a hard, fast breath that carried the weight of a long day. People here, they've got their opinions. About you, about what you're about. I've got a business to keep running. Don't need any trouble. Vance nodded, slow, letting it sink in, his mind turning it over. So me sitting down for a sandwich, that's trouble? Don didn't answer right away. His eyes flicked to the counter, where the old guy was picking at his fries. Fork moving slower now, ears perked. A few booths over, the young guy leaned forward, elbows on the table, his smirk sharpening like he was waiting for the match to catch fire. Vance knew this wasn't just about a seat or a meal. It was about him, his name, his politics, what people thought they knew from snippets on TV or heated threads online. Brothers Sandwich Haven was a small joint, but small places brew big resentment, and he could feel it simmering under the surface, ready to boil over. Be straight with me, Vance said, voice dropping low, firm as a steel beam. Is this your call, or are you just keeping the peace? Don froze. His fingers twitched against his apron, and for a split second, he looked trapped, caught between his own gut and the pressure of the room. Before he could open his mouth, the young guy in the booth cut in, loud and brash, his voice slicing through the quiet. Come on, man, this ain't complicated. You're not welcome here. Done. Vance turned, slow, locking eyes with him. The guy grinned, all teeth, leaning back like he'd thrown a punch, and was waiting for the counterblow. He was lean, wiry, the kind of guy who'd spent his 20s picking fights in bars and his 30s looking for new targets. Vance didn't bite. He looked back at Don, steady as ever. If that's what you want, I'll go. No scene. The words hung there, heavy as a storm cloud, daring Don to make it real. Don could back off, could call it a night, could tell the room to cool down. Instead, he shifted his weight, glancing at the kitchen like it might hand him an answer. I just don't want this getting ugly, he said, voice low, worn, like he'd seen ugly before, and didn't have the stomach for it again. Neither do I, Vance shot back, quick but calm. Then he did what no one saw coming. He grabbed a chair from the nearest table, pulled it out with a slow, deliberate scrape against the linoleum, and sat down. So let's talk. The diner flinched. Not loud, not wild, just a jolt that rippled through every booth and stool. Vance didn't slam the chair or shout. He just sat, hands resting flat on the table, calm as if he'd been invited to stay. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. People expected a blowout, him storming out, maybe kicking the door off its hinges, or pulling rank with a senator's swagger, threatening lawsuits or headlines. Not this. Not a guy planting himself in the middle of a rejection like it was just another Tuesday. Don stared, thrown off balance, his broad frame stiffening. Talk? he repeated like the word didn't fit in his mouth. Yeah, Vance said, shrugging, his voice steady but tired. You don't want me here, I hear you. But I don't get why. So let's sort it out. The young guy let out a low, sharp laugh, leaning forward now. This guy's got some nerve. His tone was half admiration, half taunt, like he couldn't decide if he respected it or hated it. Vance ignored him, keeping his eyes on Don. The manager hesitated, then leaned on the chair across from him, not sitting, just bracing himself, his apron streaked with flour and grease from a shift that had started at dawn. I run a business here, he said, slow, deliberate, like he was laying out a defense. I don't pick fights. I don't want my name splashed across the news, but I've got a community to think about. Folks who've been coming here for years. Vance nodded, leaning back slightly, arms crossed loose over his chest. All right, what do these folks think of me? Don glanced over his shoulder, like he was waiting for someone else to jump in and save him from this. The waitress by the counter shifted her weight, her sneakers squeaking faintly on the floor, her hands twisting a rag. The old guy's fork was still, his fries long cold, his head tilted just enough to listen. Don turned back, exhaling through his nose. Folks here don't trust politicians. Not one bit. Don't like them either. And some of the things you've said, the stuff you stand for, it doesn't sit right with them. Vance tilted his head, processing it, his face unreadable. Fair enough, but you don't know me, do you? Don paused, caught off guard again. Not face to face, no. So if I walked in here as just some guy, no name, no spotlight, would we even be doing this? Silence, thick, heavy, pressing down. Don's face twitched, a small crack in his armor. Not a full break, but enough to show he didn't have an easy answer. Then the young guy cut in again, voice sharp as a blade. This ain't about the spotlight, man. It's about who you are. Vance turned slow, meeting his eyes. The guy grinned wider, leaning in now, his leather jacket creaking as he moved. You're the suit who acts like he gets us. Regular people, working stiffs. But you're just another politician playing the same old game, talking big and delivering nothing. Vance nodded, unruffled, taking it in like he'd heard it 100 times. Okay, he said, voice calm. What should I have done different? That stopped him cold. The guy blinked, his grin faltering, thrown by the question. He'd wanted a fight, not a conversation. You're supposed to be gone, he muttered, his bravado slipping. You want me out? I get it, Vance said, steady as a rock. But you're here. Say what's eating you. The diner went still. No clatter from the kitchen, no orders shouted, no coffee poured. Just the faint sizzle of the fryer and the hum of the neon sign outside. Don sighed, rubbing his neck like this was the last damn thing he'd expected tonight. Vance cracked a faint, weary smile. Barely there, but real. Wasn't my plan either, he said almost to himself. The air shifted. Not peace, not yet, but something closer. People weren't just watching now. They were listening, leaning in, caught up despite themselves. The young guy sat back, thrown off, his smirk fading to a scowl. The old guy at the counter kept his head down, but his fork hadn't moved in minutes. He was all ears. Don gripped the chair tighter, his knuckles whitening. You want to know what they think? He said, voice low, rough. They think you're full of it. Vance didn't flinch, didn't bristle, just tilted his head like he was weighing the words. They think you talk a big game about working folks, Don went on, his tone hardening. But you're still one of them, making promises that don't mean squat when the cameras turn off. People here, they've got long memories. They don't let that go. Vance nodded, slow, deliberate, his eyes steady on Don. I get that, he said, simple, honest. The young guy scoffed, loud enough to turn heads. That's it? That's all you got? His voice carried a mix of disbelief and challenge, like he couldn't fathom the lack of a fight. Vance turned to him, calm as ever. What else you want? You've already got me pegged before I even sat down. You wanted me mad, wanted me to snap so you could say, see? Told you. But what if I told you I know that frustration? I've lived it, same as you. Don's fingers tapped the chair, his face guarded but not closed off, a flicker of doubt creeping in. Vance glanced around the room, the half-eaten sandwiches, the cold coffee mugs, the eyes that wouldn't quite meet his, but couldn't look away either. You don't have to like me, he said, voice low, real, cutting through the haze. I'm not here to sell you anything. No speeches, no votes. I just wanted a meal, not a war. A gruff voice broke in from the counter. The old guy, his tone like a rusty hinge. Damn shame a man can't even get a sandwich around here. It hit, not loud, not dramatic, but it landed, a ripple of truth through the tension. A couple folks smirked, quick and quiet. Don let out a small dry laugh, shaking his head like he couldn't believe where this was going. Vance turned back to him, steady. So where do we stand? Don ran a hand over his face, rough and unshaven, glancing at the kitchen, then back. Tell you what, he said, slow, testing the waters. You sit, we talk, and if you're not just feeding me a line by the end of it, maybe I'll get you a menu. Vance smirked, a spark lighting his tired eyes. Deal. The room didn't split wide open or heal, not yet, but it softened, the edges blurring. Don's shoulders dropped, just a fraction, the stiffness easing from his frame. The young guy lost his edge, sitting up straighter now, his smirk gone, replaced by something uncertain, like he wasn't sure what game they were playing anymore. Even the quiet ones, the ones hiding behind their plates, peeked over, caught by the shift, curiosity tugging at them. Vance leaned in, elbows on the table, hands loose. All right, he said, voice calm but firm. Let's talk. Don sank into the chair across from him, his broad frame slumping slightly, looking beat. Not just from the shift, but from years of carrying more than he let on. I'll be straight with you, he said, hands clasped tight, knuckles rough from work. I don't know if you're what they say you are. I don't know if you give a damn about folks like us or if you're just slick with words. Vance nodded, meeting his gaze. That's fair. Don studied him, eyes narrowed, searching for a lie. People here, they remember, he said, voice low, heavy. Every politician who's rolled through this town, shook hands, promised jobs would come back, promised better days, then peeled out down 68 like it was nothing. They hold on to that, every word, every handshake. Vance tapped the table with a knuckle, thinking, his mind drifting back to his own roots, small towns, broken promises, the kind of anger that festers when hope runs dry. I don't blame them, he said, quiet, real. Don huffed, almost a laugh, but it was bitter. Yeah, well, nobody ever does. Then the old guy spoke again, his voice rough as gravel, cutting through the hum. I gave 40 years to a factory, 40 damn years. He set his mug down, hard, coffee sloshing over the rim onto the counter. Watched my neighbors lose their jobs when the plant shut down. Watched families pack up and leave, 'cause there was nothing left to hold them here. Politicians came through, shook my hand, said they understood, then drove off to their big houses in Columbus or D.C. every damn time. Vance met his eyes, steady, unblinking, seeing the man's weariness mirrored in his own past. You think I'm one of them? The old man stared back, his face a map of lines carved by time and disappointment. He held the gaze for a long beat, then shrugged, slow. Don't know yet, but you're the only one who stuck around to hear it. That landed like a hammer on an anvil, ringing through the room. The waitress froze mid-step, her sneakers squeaking on the floor. The cooks in the kitchen swapped quick, silent looks through the pass-through. The young guy went quiet, his arms still crossed, but the bravado drained out of him, leaving something raw behind. Vance let the silence stretch, let it work, then turned to Don. So what's it gonna be? Don tapped the table, his thick fingers drumming a slow rhythm, his eyes flicking to the kitchen, then back. He stood, slow and deliberate, like a man making a call he wasn't sure of. Mary, he called, voice cutting through the hush. Get him a menu. A ripple ran through the diner. Surprise, unease, a thread of relief weaving through it. The young guy snorted, a weak sound with no bite left. Mary, the waitress, hesitated, her hands pausing on the rag she'd been twisting, then grabbed a laminated menu from the counter and slid it across to Vance. He took it with a small nod. Thanks, he said, simple, genuine. Don shook his head, a half smile tugging at his lips, like he couldn't believe he'd gone this far. Still not sure I like you, he said, gruff but lighter now. Vance grinned, flipping the menu open, his shoulders easing for the first time all night. Don't need you to. Don waved a hand at the kitchen, his voice barking out. Boys, fire up the grill. And just like that, what started as a cold shove out the door at Brothers Sandwich Haven turned into something else, something raw, real, etched into the memory of everyone there. The tension didn't vanish, not fully, not in a place like this, but it faded, softening around the edges. Forks clinked against plates again. Voices crept back, low and tentative, testing the waters. Vance sat there, menu in hand, but he wasn't reading it yet. He was watching. Don by the kitchen, arms crossed, still sizing him up. The old guy at the counter hunched over his mug like it held answers. The young guy now slouched in his booth. Skepticism still there, but quieter, less sure. Mary stepped over, pouring him a cup of coffee without a word, the dark liquid steaming as it hit the mug. He nodded thanks. She paused, then muttered, "It's strong. Watch yourself." He took a sip, winced as the bitter heat hit his tongue. "You weren't kidding," he said, a small grin breaking through. A few chuckles rippled out, soft, warm, unexpected. The air loosened, just enough to breathe. Don dropped back into the chair across from him, arms crossed, his apron still streaked with the day's labor. Flour, grease, a smear of ketchup from lunch rush. "Ever had this happen before?" he asked, his tone curious now, less guarded. Vance leaned back, thinking. Rejection? Sure, it came with the job. Booze at rallies, cold shoulders in meetings, the occasional heckler shouting him down. But this, a diner like Brothers Sandwich Haven, a simple stop on a long road, turning him away with this kind of weight behind it? "No," he said, honest, his voice quieter now. "Not like this." Dawn nodded slow, like that carried some meaning he hadn't expected. "And you stayed," he said, almost to himself. "Yeah," Vance replied, meeting his eyes. Don laughed, a short, rough sound, like he couldn't quite believe it. "Most guys in your shoes would have walked out, or called a lawyer, or made damn sure this place was trending online by sunrise." Vance smirked, a glint of mischief in his tired eyes. "Thought about it, briefly." Don leaned in, his voice dropping. "You won't change everyone's mind. Not here, not tonight." "I know," Vance said, shrugging, no trace of frustration in it. The old guy piped up again, his voice cutting through from the counter, eyes still on his cold fries. "Still a damn shame a man can't get a sandwich without all this." Vance grinned, turning to him. "Think we're fixing that now." Mary appeared a moment later, setting a plate down in front of him. A roast beef sandwich piled high, thick-cut fries spilling over the edge. No frills, but perfect in its simplicity. Vance picked it up, took a bite, the warm, salty meat hitting his tongue after a day of nothing but coffee and stress. The diner watched for a beat, holding its breath. Then deadpan, he said, "Little dry." Silence, tight, electric, hanging for a half-second. Then Dawn barked out a laugh, loud and real, the sound bouncing off the walls. Mary shook her head, a faint smile breaking through her guarded look. A few others joined in, soft chuckles, genuine, cutting through the last of the night's edge. Vance set the sandwich down, wiping his hands on a napkin. "Kidding," he said, grinning. "It's good. Damn good." Don smirked, shaking his head like he'd been outplayed. "You're something else, you know that?" "Been told that more than once," Vance replied, taking another bite, savoring it now. Brothers Sandwich Haven came back to life. Plates clattering as Mary cleared tables, coffee refills splashing into mugs, voices humming low like the diner was remembering how to breathe. The doubts didn't vanish. Small towns like Springfield don't let go of their grudges that easy, and Vance knew it. But for one night, in this worn-out corner of Ohio, something shifted, subtle but real. He ate slow, the food grounding him, while Don stayed put, watching, still wrestling with what to make of this stranger who wouldn't leave. The old guy at the counter finished his fries, muttering to himself about the world going soft. But there was a hint of a smile in it. The young guy slouched in his booth, arms crossed, still skeptical but out of steam, his fight drained into the cracked leather beneath him. When Vance finished, he pushed the plate aside, the last fry gone, and looked up at Don. "Thanks for the talk," he said, voice quiet, steady. Don nodded, slow, his broad hands resting on the table. "Don't make me regret this tomorrow," he said, half joking, half serious. Vance stood, pulling his coat back on, fishing a crumpled 20 from his pocket and leaving it on the table. More than the meal cost, but he didn't care. He headed for the door, the bell clanging as he stepped out into the cold night air, the gravel crunching under his boots as he crossed the lot to his truck. The neon sign flickered behind him, casting a faint glow over the empty highway stretching into the dark. "If you've made it this far, hats off to you." You're one of the rare ones, someone who really knows how to listen. J.D. Vance's story at Brothers Sandwich Haven leaves us with a solid takeaway. Sometimes, instead of walking away when rejection or conflict hits, just sticking around and hearing people out can change the game. In today's world, where social media splits us into shouting matches, where folks would rather yell than talk, sitting down, staying cool, and digging into the root of things is rare, but damn necessary. Vance didn't take the easy road. He didn't storm off or snap back. He faced it head on, not to win, but to understand. It's a reminder that no matter how deep the divide, patience and a real conversation can crack open a door to understanding, something our tense, polarized world is starving for. That's the tough path, the gritty one. Ever been there, torn between bolting out the door or staying to hear the raw truth no matter how rough it gets? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear them. If this story hits you, give it a like, subscribe, hit that bell. There's more where this came from, and I'll be back to share it. Catch you next time.